So we've come to week 10, Sunday Ordinary Time. Last week, of course, we had the Feast of the Body and Blood of Christ. Now we return to Ordinary Time. The Gospel is from Mark because it's year B, and it's talking about the mystery of evil. And then the first reading lines up with that, of course. It's from the book of Genesis. It's Genesis chapter 3. So recall that the first two chapters in Genesis have two different creation accounts. One is much more modern, the other one's much more ancient. If you take them literally, you'll get yourself into a bit of trouble because they're really poetry. And as you know very well, that great truths can be expressed poetically and using metaphors and different images that can be used much more effectively than, say, science or mathematics or other forms of truth. So truth is expressed in different ways in the Bible. That's not always the case. There are very deeply historical moments in the Bible, but these are really primordial texts, and this is telling us about the primordial sin, which we call original sin, committed by Adam and Eve. Now, this is a very interesting question because it's told in a way that engages us. In other words, that all the patterns of sin in our life will be found here in this primordial text, this very ancient primitive text, which contains, as I say, profound truths for us. So they commit the sin. The sin that they commit is being like God. The devil, Satan, says to them, he's very crafty, very clever. He says, look, you know, that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God has forbidden you to eat from, he knows that if you take a piece of fruit from it, if you take from it, if you engage it, then you'll be just like God, knowing good and evil. And of course, that's exactly what happens. They enter into the mystery of evil, the mysterium iniquitatis, we call it in the Latin language. Theology likes to use that phrase, the mystery of iniquity. And so they commit the sin, and now God comes to them after the sin, and he engages them. What he doesn't do is to accuse them. No, he sets up what St. Paul VI called a dialogue of salvation. And he asks them no less than 4 questions. It's incredible. Go and have a look at the text. Go and have a look at the questions. The first one is, where are you? And so the questions are designed, obviously not for God. God is all-knowing, all-loving. He knows what's happened. The questions are designed for Adam and Eve, for them to understand in a deeper fashion, what we say is a more existential fashion. That is, they're entering into really what has happened. We've got the fact of the sin, but what has this done now? What are the consequences of this sin? And so the questions are designed for them to say, right, let's own what we've done here, and let's now receive the promise of salvation. That's what the text is all about. This is most important for us, that when we have the experience of failure and sin, we've got to understand how God is going to come back to us. He will never point the finger at us. He will come back and engage us and help us to understand what we've done, admit what we've done, understand how it's affecting us, affecting others, and affecting our relationship with God, and on we go. Now, this brings me to a final point, which I think is most important. And this, again, is foundational for our spiritual life. That when the Bible speaks about sin, it always speaks in the same breath of salvation. It always talks about sin and salvation. Never ever does it isolate sin. Never ever does it isolate salvation. It puts the two together. So if you come across certain writings or preachings or gatherings where sin is overemphasized or where salvation is overemphasized, everything's fine, then forget it. Put it aside and move on. The best of theology is always, the best of the teaching is always the reality of sin, which is a separating factor, and the reality of salvation, which is a saving and healing factor, putting things back together. And that is always the case in the Bible. So go to the ministry of Christ. Go to when he's dealing with people who have been sinful, and he offers them the promise of salvation. They have to admit the problem, admit the truth, but also of their own personal reality of their sin, but then they've got to reach out for the promise of salvation which is there. So this is a most important text. It's Genesis chapter 3 this week.